Hello and welcome to the Fazlaw show. Most people don't know what to expect or do when faced with a legal problem, whether it be in labor law, matrimonial law, debt counseling, property law, or more. We aim to give our viewers a better understanding of the law in South Africa to ensure that the vulnerable are not taken advantage of. In this show, we address your questions, which you can send to us via the platform, such as your WhatsApp and our email address. The information will be provided to you at the end of the show. So don't forget to send us your questions to ensure that we cover your questions. I'm your host, Fazlaw Abrams, and you're watching the Fazlaw show on Cape Town TV. Youth Day in South Africa is a very important day, and we want to honor the courage and the sacrifices of the Soweto uprising to celebrate all the youth in South Africa. So today's episode, we want to dedicate to those who made valuable sacrifices. And we want you as the youth out there to be confident, be yourself, grow yourself, and become a better version of who you can be. With me today, we have a special legal guest, Nazir Parker, who is an attorney who specializes in commercial litigation and is well-rounded in all areas such as the landlord and tenant disputes, evictions particularly, where he holds a certificate in advanced eviction law, and he also specializes in debt recoveries. Nazir, thank you for being on the show today.
Good afternoon, Fazlaw, and to your viewers, and thank you for having me on the show. It's a pleasure to be here.
So, Nazir, as you've heard, the show is about answering the questions of our viewers, and I want to get into that, but how we'll deal with it is we'll deal with statements, and I want you to explain those statements. So I'm going to start off with, currently, we are looking at the economy, and the economy is quite in a bad state. So we are saying that people usually don't or can't afford to purchase a new vehicle, and the second option would be to purchase a second-hand vehicle. However, that industry itself is fraught with lots of non-compliance and injustices that are carried out towards unsuspecting buyers. Now, with regards to those, or that statement that I've just made, what is the purpose of the Consumer Protection Act related in that regard?
Well, Fazlaw, I think the important thing is we first need to understand what the gist of or what the purpose of the Consumer Protection Act was in overall sense before we specifically categorize it in respect of vehicles. Prior to the enactment of the Consumer Protection Act, the consumer rights wasn't regulated. There were maybe scattered pieces of legislation that would help the consumer out, but nothing concrete enough. In 2011, in April, that all changed, where the President had enacted the Consumer Protection Act, and that now gave rise to a whole host of consumer rights, more stringent duties on your suppliers, and consequences if they don't fulfill those duties. Specifically with regard to vehicles, dealerships and people who are selling vehicles in the ordinary course have now become a lot more cognizant of the consumer rights. They are no longer able to just sell vehicles without being diligent about it, taking the necessary care. Consumers are now feeling a lot safer than what they used to in the past because of this law.
Thanks, Nazir. And my next question is the information that a supplier is supposed to provide to the purchaser or the buyer. What information is that, just in summary?
Well, Fazlaw, when it comes to purchasing vehicles, especially on the second-hand market, it is important that the suppliers supply the make, the model, the overall status of that vehicle, the service history of the vehicle. Has the vehicle been involved in an accident? Is it what they term as code 2 insofar as ensuring the vehicle is concerned? All of those information has become a vital part of everyday transacting in a second-hand vehicle market.
Perfect. So what does the term voetstoets now mean in terms of the CPA?
Well, voetstoets used to be a very loose term. Unfortunately, again, I stress that it used to be a very abused term. However, it still applies in today's market, in today's law, but in a different, like I said, in a regulated manner. Voetstoets enables the supplier to sell a vehicle in its current state, in its current form. However, the supplier has a more onerous duty on him in order to ensure that the buyer, the consumer, ultimately is completely aware of every detail of that vehicle. Defects, whether it be latent or patent, needs to be completely disclosed to the consumer. If the consumer then, whilst being completely informed, is aware of everything and is happy to purchase the vehicle in that particular state, only then will footstoots then be applicable. However, if something was disclosed or misrepresented or not disclosed, then it's a different ballgame.
So now we've got the receipt. The buyer purchased a vehicle, he receives a receipt, and on that receipt has got information. What's the importance of that information, and why is it so important?
Well, the receipt is the end document of your transaction. It basically now captures every detail. The supplier's details needs to be placed on there in full. The make, model, and details of the vehicle needs to be placed out there in full. The date of the transaction is very important to be captured there, because we'll discuss that later on insofar as the guarantees are concerned. And also the value of the sale, including all taxes, including any underlying registration costs and licensing fees. All of those things needs to be completely disclosed on that docket.
So don't end up being a he said, she said situation in dispute. It's not like a simple receipt, just I paid 100,000 Rand for this vehicle and that's it. It's no longer that. It's now a detailed receipt with all that information you just mentioned now. And that gives clarity as to what the terms and conditions were of the sale as well. Right? Just quickly, I mean, usually a contract with regards to buying a second-hand vehicle or even a new vehicle has its legal jargon, the terms and conditions. And the question that I want you to answer is simply like, what are the consumer's rights when it comes to that contract? Because legal jargon is something that your layperson don't usually understand.
Correct, Fazlaw. You know, the old saying stands true where the big print gives you something and the small print takes it away. Unfortunately, in today's day and age, with the enactment of this particular act, the law has become more clearer in that any transaction that is being written and recorded in writing needs to be in plain, simple language. Where you find that it is still containing legal jargon, as you are saying, the supplier has a duty to go through that entire contract with that consumer, let the consumer understand all the material terms. And if the consumer will insist, then they need to try and codify that in plainer, simpler language so that the consumer will understand it better and contract with him better. But it's important, vital, that the language that is contained in the contract is something that the consumer will understand. If he doesn't understand it, there will be grounds for putting that contract aside at a later stage.
So in simple terms, the consumer can simply say, I don't understand this term, can you explain it to me? If
Correct.
it's not explained, then he's got grounds to dispute it at a later stage.
Correct.
Nazir, hold the thought. We're going to our ad break, and then we'll follow up after this. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for watching so far. We've come to the end of the first segment of the show. Keep watching for answers to your questions, and we'll be back after the break. Thank you. Welcome back to the Fazlaw Show. I'm your host, Fazluddin Abrams, and in the first segment, we had an introduction of what we're going to discuss today. We also met our special guest and legal expert, Nazir Parker, and we looked at particularly the purpose of the Consumer Protection Act with regards to buying second-hand vehicles. We also looked at the information that should be on the receipt when you purchase a vehicle, and we then obviously looked at the fact that it's very important for you as a viewer to send us your questions. If you don't send us your questions, we won't have the answers for you on the show. So please, I want to remind you to send your questions. And if you've just joined us, we will now proceed with more questions to the legal expert. And Nazir, I've got a statement that needs to be answered, right? So it says here that we need to ask the dealership of the fact whether the motor vehicle that you're purchasing still has the original engine and also the sachet number. Why is that? Can you explain that to the viewers, please?
Fazlaw, unfortunately, in the trade of dealerships and second-hand vehicles, you will often find there will be a lot of underhanded business going on with regard to what they term and phrase as chop shops. Vehicles are stolen, vehicles are then taken apart, body parts are put on other vehicles, engines are taken out and put on other vehicles. It's a common thing. And unfortunately, that's how the criminals disguise the stolen parts. They put an illegal part in a legal vehicle. So when it comes to purchasing a second-hand vehicle from a dealer, it's important that you understand that the engine number corresponds with the original registration certificate. It's not a problem if it does not, provided that all the necessary legal steps has been taken in order to legalize the new engine in the vehicle, such as you're saying, a police engine clearance at the SAPS offices. And that's important because that will then confirm that the engine hasn't been stolen. And also the chassis number, which is what we call a VIN, vehicle identity number, must also correspond with the registration paper, so that you know the vehicle you are purchasing is actually the vehicle that's identified on the national system.
Thank you. Another statement that needs clarification to our viewers is that when you buy a vehicle, you need to confirm the make, the model, and the quality of the vehicle. Why is that?
Well, Fazlaw, sometimes you will find as well that, there's so many cars on the roads these days, so unfortunately sometimes it can get mixed up. I've experienced it myself in my personal capacity. So it's important that the viewers understand that the make, the model, and the state of the vehicle is confirmed. Otherwise, they won't have the recourse that the law allows them. The important aspect that I want to stress with the viewers is that in the event that they are purchasing a vehicle and they're unsure of the quality of that vehicle, they need to make sure they do what the necessary quality checks. Even if it costs them out of pocket for now, it will be in the long run a better solution for them, because
I want to deal with that particular topic later. I'm going to ask you a question on it. Sure. Just coming back to what the viewers would like to know, another statement that needs clarity on is roadworthy certificate. And we're talking about the quality of the vehicle. So when you purchase a vehicle, the vehicle has to go for roadworthy before it can be transferred onto the new owner's name. And that roadworthy center issues a roadworthy certificate confirming that the quality of the vehicle is in good order, in good standing. And there are times where, I personally had a client where he bought a vehicle and the rear of the vehicle was welded together. And there was no way the vehicle could have been clear of not being a coded vehicle, which is code 2 or 3, or it's rebuilt. This is a vehicle that should have been not coded. Well, should have been coded, but it was not coded. That means that there are times where roadworthy centers either issues clearance certificates or roadworthy certificates without doing the proper checks. Are we saying then that there's corruption going on? And I don't want you to deal with the corruption. I'm just looking at, is that a possibility, and how does one deal with that?
Fazlaw, unfortunately, it's not uncommon that you will find certain roadworthy centers, and I'm not going to name any center for this particular show, that would pass vehicles like you identified now in your example with your experience. However, the reputable guys, the guys that are following protocol, would never have allowed, they wouldn't even pass a vehicle if there's a faulty seatbelt or a broken light bulb. They would insist that be repaired before they pass it. The roadworthy certificates are valid for 60 days, and the roadworthy centers will insist that all the necessary prerequisites are met before they issue it. Unfortunately, again, it is so that sometimes you will find every now and then they will look past certain things for whatever reason. I can't stress that.
Sure. And I think I want just you to elaborate on the answer that you were going to give earlier with regards to these roadworthy certificates, like the quality on the product and so forth. So just elaborate a bit more on, for example, you have the right to take the vehicle to an inspection, who is unrelated to the dealer. Just explain that a bit to me.
So, roadworthy aspect is one thing. Quality of a vehicle is another thing entirely. So, normally, and my advice to the viewers are that when they go and purchase a vehicle, even if the dealer warrants that the vehicle has met all the necessary quality checks, you as a consumer have the right to have that vehicle assessed independently at your own quality assessor. Ensure that all the necessary checks and balances are in place. And the suppliers will ask you for a contribution to the cost, which is, again, I must stress, not unreasonable in the context of what you could save long term. So if it's going to cost you a couple of rands now, it's better to pay those rands and have the certainty that you need, because the Act again says that once you've accepted the vehicle in its state, then you have very little recourse afterwards.
Another statement that I want the viewers to get an understanding of is the waiver of their rights. Can a purchaser be expected to waive liability in favor of the supplier?
It's a common question, Fazluddin, not just in this context, but in many others. Unfortunately, for the suppliers and fortunately for the consumers, it cannot be so that you can waive your legislated rights through contract. Those will still take preference over any contract that you would sign.
So if you see a contract where you're purchasing a vehicle and it says that I waive my rights for any claim and I won't sue the seller or the purchaser, the supplier, then run away from that contract, run away from the dealer. He's trying to get you to maybe admit or agree to not suing at a later stage. That would be the answer, right? Just run as far as you can from that dealer.
Correct. I wouldn't advocate or promote that in any way.
Right. Let's see. What else? Now, terms and conditions in the contract. I want to touch on that again. It needs to be expressly brought to the attention of the purchaser or the buyer before they enter into the contract. Just elaborate on that. I mean, like, why is it so, and what happens if you don't? Can a person claim ignorance and say, I didn't know, you never explained it to me? That's what I want you to deal with.
You see, Fazluddin, you're going to have to mix up the legal position insofar as legislation is concerned and then what we term as common law. So unfortunately, the common law position is that once you sign, you must be aware of what you're signing, and whatever you're going to try and express in evidence is going to be confined to the four corners of your agreement. So unfortunately, if your agreement says X, Y, and Z and it's illegal, that is what is going to be binding the consumer within the confirming with the Consumer Protection Act.
Hold that thought. I want you to continue after the next segment. We've come to an ad break and to the end of the second segment. Keep watching for more answers to your questions. I'm your host, Fazlaw Abrams. Welcome back again to the Fazlaw Show. I'm your host, Fazlaw Abrams, and we are back with the third segment of the show, where we had a recap on the first segment. We also looked at the requirements where the engine was replaced in a motor vehicle and the quality of the vehicle that you are about to purchase. We also discussed the legitimacy of the roadworthy certificate. And if you've just joined us, keep watching for more answers to your questions. Nazir, I want to focus now on where we left off in the previous segment. You spoke about the fact that a purchaser or buyer of a motor vehicle cannot claim ignorance. He cannot say it was never explained. You were finishing off on that statement. And just quickly, if a person is illiterate, he cannot read, he cannot write, would he then be able to claim that? Give us an answer to that, please.
You see, Fazluddin, the last part is a very difficult answer, but I'll try and do my best to answer it for you. Just to recap, if you are signing an agreement, you are undertaking to yourself and to the supplier you've read and understood it. More importantly, you understand it, and that you are accepting that the terms and conditions of that agreement will bind you in the long term. The moment you sign it, you cannot look for any assistance outside of that agreement. That's the legal position. When it comes to being illiterate, for example, and you don't understand, cannot read or write, your supplier needs to go a step further and needs to ensure that there is a complete understanding, even in the most simplest of terms, what is being done under the agreement itself. If perhaps for the supplier's benefit, maybe they can even get a witness in to attest to the fact that the consumer has understood everything from A to Z. But you would have instances limited, though, where duress may come into play. You know, I didn't understand it completely, but I wanted the vehicle. Yeah. It's unfortunately extremely difficult to prove that in our legal system in today's day and age.
I think that covers it. Thank you, Nazir. So just with regards to ensuring the safety or the safety of consumers with regards to purchasing a vehicle, the good quality, the good working order, and no defects. Those are issues that the product need to be covered, right, when purchasing a vehicle. In other words, it must be good quality, it must be good working order, and it must have no defects. How do we deal with that?
You see, Fazluddin, it's a two-way street in my opinion. I think that the supplier and the consumer both needs to take responsibility for that. At the end of the day, as a consumer, you can't just go on the good word of the supplier. You need to actually go and physically see that the vehicle is in good order, it's driving right, there's no funny noises coming out of the engine when you drive the vehicle, the gears change like it should. If you pick those problems up, then you need to deal with it during the pre-contracting stage. Because remember, you're still in the negotiation stage at that point. However, once you go into the contracting stage, you then undertaking that the vehicle is as it should be.
So with regards to the CPA, the buyer has 6 months to exercise his rights, and the rights are, he has the right to return the vehicle for repair, replace, or refund. Explain that and pack that for us, please.
Right, Fazluddin, so the Consumer Protection Act specifically, it's a very common thing in transactions with dealerships, and I get asked this question more often than not. Firstly, the Consumer Protection Act guarantees you certain consumer rights, specifically with regard to proper products, and that will also extend to vehicles. And the Act specifically also, as you say, makes provision for a 6-month warranty period, that in the event that the vehicle breaks down or the vehicle gives you an issue within that 6-month period and that dealership sells vehicle in its ordinary business, the dealership as the supplier in that transaction has a duty to ensure that the vehicle is either repaired at its own expense, that the faulty part is replaced at its own expense, or if it needs to go that far, that the contract is then cancelled and the parties are put back into its pre-contracting state. He takes the vehicle and the consumer gets the funds.
Excellent answer. And I think we're getting the bigger picture of that. It's the responsibility of the buyer then to insist on taking the vehicle for another inspection, asking the right questions, don't just willy-nilly trust the dealer to be working in good faith. I'm not saying that dealers are working in bad faith, but take some responsibility when you enter into a contract for the purchase of a vehicle. Right? All right. Now I need you to look at the choice of the inspection report. I know you mentioned it before, but I want you to unpack it a little bit more. So in other words, if the dealer says that you have the right, or let's say the CPA says that you have the right to ask for a inspection report by an independent inspector, you can literally tell the dealer that I want that. And if the dealer refuses, you know these red flags, you need to step back or look for another dealership. Is that correct?
Correct.
That's what
I agree,
ultimately saying.
I agree with you 2,000%. Unfortunately, it's going to be an uncomfortable conversation, but rather have that 30 minutes or 30 seconds of our discomfort and have long-term surety insofar as the product you're purchasing. Like I said earlier on, there may be a contribution out of your own pocket in order to do that independent assessment. But again, I'd stress that it's going to be rather better for you to fork out a little bit of pennies at that point as opposed to having the damages in the long run.
And I think one need to realize that we're living in a world where you have good people and bad people. And when you have dealing with bad, unscrupulous people, they tend to turn back the kilometers of vehicles. Explain that, what happens in that situation where the buyer needs to be aware of and look out for. How do they check that?
Well, Fazluddin, you see, that's a very difficult assessment to make. You see, when you're buying a product, you look at it on face value. I mean, you don't have the...
I think one needs to look at the service history, right? The book will tell you these kilometers and stuff, and then you look at the actual kilometers. So if the service history book is missing, then you know there's something wrong there. So can you elaborate on that for us, please?
Fortunately, also with today's day and age, people are buying vehicles that are all codified through computer systems. So
if the book is missing, go to your dealer or original dealer, like the branded companies, and they will be able to see the service history on their
Correct.
computer.
So you basically give the dealership your what we spoke about earlier, your VIN number, and they will pick up the whole history of that vehicle on their systems.
Nazir, thank you for being a guest on our show. We've come to the end of the questions and answers. You've been a great expert, and we hope to see you back soon.
Thank you, Fazluddin, and thank you for having me.
That brings us to the end of the show, ladies and gentlemen. Before you leave, make sure you send us your questions to the platforms. Our email address is info@fazlaw, that's info@fazlaw.co.za, and our WhatsApp number being 082 495 8989. Our next episode will be discussing what you as a spouse or a child or descendant or an heir can do with regards to the loss of a loved one and how to deal with the master's office when dealing with a deceased estate. Don't forget to follow us on YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. I'm your host, Fazlaw Abrams, and thank you for watching the Fazlaw Show on Cape Town TV.